One of the most important ways that we can explore our inner leadership, that is, explore our self-making as leaders, is through the concept of authenticity. Authenticity has been a term, like leadership and creativity, going back to the ancient Greeks. For our purposes here, authenticity and authentic leadership came into prominence more recently. And while a very powerful concept and approach, it's also quite contested. And we're going to talk about some of the challenge of using authenticity to describe, in fact, to advance our own leadership, even as we develop some tools and practices around authenticity that each of us can use, in fact, to make or remake ourselves as leaders and as better people. We might begin in talking about authenticity by looking at a paradox. The paradox is that leaders need to be able to reconcile what may appear two separate and contrasting realities. One reality is that we as leaders want to be consistently authentic, that is, faithful to our core values, beliefs, and principles. At the same time, we as leaders want and need to be adaptable to what are oftentimes wildly varying and changing situations and contexts. So how is it that we can be both authentic to ourselves, but also adaptable to different situations? As you might imagine, scholars, practitioners, researchers have come up with a number of different ways to square that circle, to reconcile that seeming paradox. One of them involves understanding deeply our own past. How did we become who we are? That is to say, by mining our past, by mining our own individual history, how can we understand those core values and principles around which we want to develop authenticity in our lives and in our leadership? Bill George, a former industry executive, he was the CEO of Medtronic, the largest medical technology company in the United States, and later a professor of practice at Harvard Business School. Written a number of books, including True North and Discovering Your True North, talks about what he calls crucible moments. It's a term he actually took from another leadership scholar, Warren Bennis, but in George's usage, crucible moments are those moments or experiences, oftentimes early in our lives, might be 9, 10, 11 years old, into our teenage years, when we had a very formative experience. It may have been a crisis. George talks about leaders that he's interviewed who experienced death for the first time, say of a relative. Maybe they themselves had a protracted sickness and had an important realization about their own weakness or about how fragile life was. So what George recommends is that each of us develop an understanding of different crucible moments, different formative experiences from those early years. And as one of our exercises, really it's a personal challenge, I want to ask each of us to mine our own personal history, go back perhaps to our teenage years, and reflect very honestly on a formative moment. And I wouldn't ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do myself, so I'll give you a very brief example. When I was 14 years old, I was growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan in the United States, in a very, very happy childhood. Both my parents were with me. All 4 of my grandparents were with me. My mother's father, my maternal grandfather, was a man who had grown up with 3 daughters, my mother and my 2 aunts. So there were no boys in the family. And when I came as a grandson, he was overjoyed. and he spoiled me. He always took a lot of special time to play with me growing up because he had never had that experience with his own children, all girls. Well, when I was 14, I got home from high school one day and I found my mother crying. And my mother wouldn't say why. And it took several hours, really until my father came home, for me to learn that my mother learned that day that in her late 30s, she had been adopted, that my grandparents had raised her, but never told her that she was not their biological child. Now, as crucible moments go, this was not a death, this was not a life-threatening sickness, but it was a profound shock, and it was, for my mother, an extraordinarily emotional violation of trust. She swore that night that she was not going to talk again to my grandparents. Now, this was difficult for me because I love my grandparents, and my grandfather especially spoiled me, so I enjoyed spending time with them. And in fact, I often rode my bike, as teenagers do, out to see my grandparents after school ended. And I thought to myself, when I heard my mother was no longer going to talk to my grandparents, what was going to happen to me and my relationship with them, and especially my grandfather. Some time passed, a few days, and nothing really changed, and I was depressed. My father was not, of course, in a position to intervene, but when I talked to him about this, he actually said, David, you might be someone who could help with the situation. I said, how can I help? You know, this is between my mom and my grandparents. My father said, maybe you could help create some sort of bridge between your grandparents and your mother. Well, to make a long story short, I rode out one day on my bike to see my grandparents, and I implored them. I requested that they do their best to reconnect and communicate with my mother. Both of them were proud, and while they said they loved me and I was always welcome, they said that things were really up to her. So I had a very long bike ride back home, and I felt nothing had changed. But a couple days later, my grandfather, very proud man, called my mother. And that gesture, that reaching out to my mother, didn't resolve this very emotional situation in one day, but it was the beginning of a series of conversations that led back to not quite the way things were, but a resumption of a lot of communication, and as we all ended up agreeing, a lot of love in the family. I look back to that moment as not necessarily so much an accomplishment of mine, but a moment when I realized how important stepping into difficult situations, especially difficult situations involving the communication or the relationship between other people, can be. Teaching in my own small way, I think, is an extension to that. But the point of whatever lessons I take from that experience, or any of us take from crucible moments, is not necessarily that there is a direct link. We can't, in a difficult moment today, look back to our teenage years and say, oh, well, I made a decision or I took this action then, now I know what to do. It's not that simple. But part of what looking back, as I do, to that moment when I was 14, and realized part of what I had done had enabled my grandfather and my mother to reconnect. Part of that can be encouraging to us, and it can be a reminder of what we carry within us as a character strength, as a virtue, and ultimately as one of those leadership actions that we all need in different ways to take based on context. So with my story in mind, what I would ask each of you to do is to take a few minutes and reflect on, write a few words about an experience of your own. Again, you can be 9 or 10 years old, you can be from your teenage years. If you want an example behind mine, think of the character Riley in the film Inside Out, who suffered through a crucible experience when her family uprooted her from her idyllic existence in Minnesota and took her to the Bay Area of San Francisco. What happened to you in your teenage years that was especially impactful? Why is that memory important to you? And yes, as part of our exploration of authenticity and our own inner leadership, why is that memory relevant to the leadership work that you do today? Why is that memory relevant to the values and principles that you want to help shape who you are as a leader and as a human being going forward? The exercise that we just went through, identifying crucible moments or life stories that remain central to us, remain central to our understanding of who we are, those can be invaluable in terms of illustrating for us core beliefs and principles. And like me, you may have been struck over time in listening to very senior leaders, CEOs, presidents, prime ministers, referencing experiences in their life that are particularly memorable and again, that illustrate their values and beliefs. We should all do that. Part of what that requires is that we go through the hard work of finding those crucible moments, identifying the life stories that in fact illustrate the values that we continue to carry with us and again that we try to act on. Now this is all hard work, and oftentimes leading ourselves is the most tiring and difficult of leadership work that we do. It's harder maybe than dealing with other people for some, certainly harder than making decisions about the allocation of resources or organizational redesign or however we're going to play in the marketplace. So part of what we need to do as leaders who have an inner focus, who have a focus on ongoing self-making, is to be sure to replenish, to restore, to renew ourselves. We need to understand, we'll talk more about refreshing our energy in another lesson.